Hello, everyone. Jess Pettit here. And who do I have the pleasure of interviewing today?
My name is Joe Gerstandt. I live in Omaha, Nebraska, which I like to refer to as the middle of everywhere before you get that twisted. And I do workplace diversity and inclusion work. And I've been doing this work as an external consultant for about 13 years now. And before that, I did it internally for corporations and in the nonprofit space. Altogether, I've been involved in this work for close to 20 years now. And a big part of my focus is on working with leaders and leadership teams, and especially on the inclusion aspect, understanding what inclusion really is, and really understanding the behavioral components of inclusion. If we want people to feel more included, what kinds of behaviors do employees and leaders need to deploy in the workplace? There still seems to be a lot of organizations that are building programs and things, but they're not tackling the behavioral piece. And I think the behavioral piece is one of the biggest pieces of it. So that's a pretty big focus of my work, and happy to be here with you today, Jess.
Absolutely. And Joe, you are the first repeat. Welcome. Welcome back. You survived round one. And I'm glad you used the word deploy, because when I describe you to my own clients, I describe you as the now what's. So you've thought about it, you've created the PowerPoint, you've done all of that. That's amazing. So now what are you going to do? And those action pieces tend to be hard to talk about in advance, and they're hard to talk about when they're needed, but that is what people are not doing. So I'm glad you used the word deployment.
Right. Let there be some consequences for all of this.
Right? Do it. Just, yeah. Nike has something to say about that. Okay, so you may recall from the last time how this works. I'm going to ask you two open-ended questions that are ideas rattling around in my brain. And I'm curious how maybe the answers are similar or how they have changed. Then I'm going to ask you my two favorite questions. And then we're going to ask you lightning round, because you picked random numbers that are from my icebreaker cards. So first one, random idea in my head, the idea of diversity dividend. This originally showed up in my brain because I have to talk to organizations about the ROI of doing diversity work. But I'm curious, especially now after this 14 months of COVID and your very busy schedule during this period of time, the concept of diversity dividend, how does that land for you?
I think it lands well. I don't know if I love the phrasing, just because I think I'm becoming increasingly aware of the fact that we throw a lot of language at people with this work. And if I think to those of us that are involved in it, it doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're new, you have to know what diversity means, and inclusion and equity and belonging and bias and privilege and micro inequities, and there's 100 other things. And I think it is a lot. And so I'm kind of leaning in the direction of let's say the things that we need to say, but let's try not to introduce a lot of new language and phrasing to people. But and I think we're on a similar page regarding the business case conversation. I think I'm done with that conversation at this point. If you don't understand that on a basic level, I don't think you should be working with people, and you certainly shouldn't be leading people, because you're fundamentally confused about human beings. That being said, when I think of the phrase diversity dividend, it is thinking about that marginal contribution, the unique contribution that difference makes to a relationship or a group or an organization. The beautiful thing about being intentional about inviting more diversity in is it gives you more ingredients to play with. And the more ingredients you have to play with, the greater the variance in the outcomes, the more stuff you can create and discover and learn and innovate. And so I think we still have a lot of work to do there. Just because a diversity of people are invited to a group, that still doesn't mean that they can contribute their uniqueness. Like, there's another layer of work involved. And that's kind of the work of inclusion, right? Making it safe for people who are naturally different from each other to actually tell the truth to each other, to share their uniqueness and their difference. So to me, I see the diversity dividend as, that's the doorway. Difference is a doorway. It allows us to learn and discover and explore different things. So I think even though it's a quiet and kind of subtle thing to some extent, it's a pretty powerful thing that we're talking about.
Yeah. And I really appreciate you being like done with the previous conversation. It's interesting. I'm in an MBA program, thanks COVID. And one of the fascinating things is when we talk about the triple bottom line versus the quadruple bottom line, the triple bottom line is people, planet, and profits. So I feel like we focused a lot on profits, and then occasionally, maybe recreationally, we talk about the planet. And then instead of talking about people, we've just added a fourth P now. Now we talk about the quadruple bottom line, which is people, planet, profits, and your purpose. Like, what's your organizational purpose? How does that feed into the planet? And is the planet, how does it feed into profits? And is the planet part of your purpose? Because we forgot to talk about people again. So I think that's important to name. So awesome. Okay. Other big idea rolling around in here that I think also is still applicable and may even have some new connotations is asterisk other duties assigned. So whether possibly working from home, this hybrid model, going back to work, now asterisk other duties assigned might be unrewarded labor. It might be community building. It might be all of the other things that you are doing out of fear of job security. How does asterisk other duties assigned land on you now?
Yeah, I think it's always been a part of this work, and I would agree. I think it's a bigger part of the work now. I think, one of the things that I always try to think about and pay attention to in organizations is what are the unwritten rules of the workplace? And a lot of times when I first say that, people aren't sure what I'm talking about because we're not used to thinking about them or looking for them. But I think most workplaces have a whole bunch of unwritten rules, and unwritten rules make everything more difficult and usually more risky because they're not based in the shared values. They don't come from the policy manual, the performance expectation. They're unwritten. But there's a lot of power dynamics that are buried in those unwritten rules. And so I think asterisks and other duties as assigned is something that shows up in there. We may have the same explicit job description, but do we have the same implicit expectations for what we're willing to do and what we're not going to do? Who plans birthday parties probably doesn't show up in anybody's job description, but you probably know in your organization who does that work, who takes notes in the meetings. And again, this is all probably amplified in COVID in a distributed virtual workplace. So I do think that's an important part of the work. And it's another one of those aspects of the work that's kind of quiet and subtle. It doesn't look super intentional. It's not loud and aggressive. It's easy to overlook, especially if you're not on the receiving end of some of those expectations. But I think it's some of the most important stuff to pay attention to as leaders, because there's power dynamics behind it. There's in-group, out-group dynamics behind it. And that's only kind of a layer or two away from inclusion, exclusion. So I think the more I can encourage leaders to think about and look for unwritten rules and declare war on them, I think that's a really valuable thing to do, not just for diversity and inclusion stuff and equity stuff, but to make sure that your values are actually your values, because a lot of times those unwritten rules run counter to it. There's a lot of organizations that say they value work-life balance. It might be spray painted on the wall, but there's an unwritten expectation that if you're not at your desk at 7 p.m., and maybe we're not living in that world anymore, but if you're not at your desk at 7 p.m., you're clearly not serious about your job. We say this thing out loud, but there's this unwritten rule that actually pushes behavior in a different direction. I think a lot of organizations have a lot of unwritten rules.
Yeah, no, I think it's totally true. One of the ways, and we talked about this before I hit record, but one of the ways I incorporate many of the ideas that you have taught me that have informed my work is specifically when talking about what to do, what actions to do to counteract unconscious bias. I did not steal your slide. You shared it with me, but I put it in my deck, and it's the one that is specifically, and I'm going to mess up the quote now because normally I read it on a deck, but let's just say you're not responsible for your first thought. Now, for the record, that is a side conversation I would love to have, but okay, a pass, a coupon. You are not responsible for your first thought, but you are responsible for your second thought, because your second thought can then inform your action or your response. I literally talk about you and your work every single time I do a webinar, because it is that action of inserting the second thought that could affirm the first, but it's inserting that's a doing, that's a deployment, right? Because that's what informs your actions. I'm going to put my pen down and just listen. Joe, tell us what that means, how that shows up in your work, where did it come from, and what are you doing with it, and what are your clients doing with it?
I wish I had a better answer for where it came from. I would almost guarantee it's not originally my line. I'm probably sure that I heard that or read that somewhere else. I don't know where it comes from, but I do think it's an important
humility, just for the record.
I do think it's an important thing to understand about bias. We still seem to associate the idea of bias with what kind of person you are. Good people don't have bias and bad people do have bias. But I think it's important to understand that there's a whole big chunk of your brain that you're not in charge of. And it's not connected to your values, your aspirations, your beliefs. It just responds to stimuli. If I say to you right now in this moment, whatever you do not think of a pink elephant. You're not a bad person because a pink elephant just blew up in the back of your head. There's a whole big bunch of your brain that doesn't follow the rules. It doesn't care about being inclusive. It doesn't care about being politically correct. It's just automatically responding to stimuli. That's where you're not responsible for your first thought comes from. So it's important to understand that. And it's also important to make sure that you don't let that first thought determine your behavior because it's horribly uninformed. And it's also important that you don't spend a bunch of time feeling guilty about it. There's no reason to feel guilty about it because you didn't choose it. It's an automatic response to stimuli. There's no choice involved. Where your personal power comes in is in choosing that second thought, because you can choose that and your behavior. That's the important thing to pay attention to. That's where your personal power lies, right? We don't want to respond to things and people automatically. We want to respond to them in ways that reflect our values, our aspirations, our beliefs. We want to prove that we are, in fact, the person that we claim to be. And so I think for a lot of people, that's a valuable insight and a valuable way to think about this idea of bias. Certainly there's conscious bias in the world. That's a real thing. Believe me, that's a real thing. That's a little bit different from what we're talking about here. We jump to conclusions. We make assumptions. The brain just does that. It's always going to do that. But we can do some things to keep it in check and to make sure that it doesn't compromise our interactions and our decision making.
Yeah. First off, yes, please listen to this. When I'm confronted with people who tell me they never make judgments and assumptions, this is where this shows up. The bridge between your work and my work is that instead of pretending that you never make judgments and assumptions, what would happen if you could just be responsible for the ones that you do? Because we often make judgments and assumptions so that we can feel safe and prepared. Right. It doesn't make us accurate. Right. But our life has taught us that when these certain stimuli come in, we know what to do. We know when to put our cussing filter in, or when to wear a tie, or when to use slang, or when to show up in jeans. That doesn't make you right, but it makes you feel safe and prepared, and you can always get more accurate.
Absolutely.
I love your work.
I think properly understood bias is kind of like the blind spot that you have when you're driving your car. It's just a natural part of the situation. And as long as you remember that blind spot is there and check it from time to time, it's no big deal. But if you convince yourself that because you're a really good driver, you don't have a blind spot, it becomes a really big deal. And that's kind of where a lot of people are at. They're convinced that because they have good intentions, they don't have any bias. And so those biases are running amok. It's kind of hard to do something about something that you're not able to acknowledge. So I think that's a pretty important place to start.
Yeah. And that acknowledgement is moving from unconscious to consciousness, right? Like the gap between intention and application is becoming conscious of what you are unconscious of, which will then backfill with more unconscious stuff. Joe, I miss you. Remember?
I might have to think about that one a little bit more, but I think so.
Yeah. I just want to say that I'm not even a huggy person, but someday I'm actually going to hug on you again.
It'll happen. It'll happen.
It'll be quick because I'm not a hugger, but just so you know.
I'm not either, but I'm looking forward to it.
We could talk about hugging. I'm all about talking about hugging. Okay. Are you ready for my 2 favorite questions?
I'm ready.
What have you changed your mind about lately?
Gosh, several things just popped into my head. I think one of the things is something that I kind of alluded to. I spent a lot of years amassing all of the business case data. For years, I was the person that would show up and I would beat you senseless with science and data. I would make you submit to the science and the data, because when I first came into this work, I felt like the science and the data was a little bit missing from the conversation. And so that was my focus. And I'm not saying that stuff doesn't have any value, but I think I've come back to realize that this isn't about facts and figures. It's not about profit. It's not about business case. This is about what kind of human beings we are. This is about what kind of human beings we choose to be, what kind of human beings we choose to be in relationship, what kind of human beings we choose to be as organizations. This is much more about this stuff than it is about this stuff. And that's a departure from most of the nature of most of the work that I've done the past 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. Excellent. Second favorite question. What do you absolutely know?
Ugh. I know that I love my children.
That's important. That's good. My answer for what do I absolutely know in this exact second, less romantic, but pickle and peanut butter sandwich is actually my favorite sandwich now.
I'm highly offended at the mere suggestion of that.
Is it the pickles or the death paste?
It's the paste. There's only like one or two ways I can tolerate peanut butter. I can eat it on celery. Any kind of peanut butter sandwich is highly offensive to me. I'm a big pickle fan.
Got ya. All right. I will fully admit my husband's favorite sandwich is a sliced dill pickle on crunchy peanut butter. And I almost didn't even go on a second date with him when he reviewed this very strange factoid. And due to COVID, he is correct. This is being recorded, isn't it? Damn it.
Duly noted.
All right. Icebreaker questions. You picked 3 numbers. I have icebreaker cards. There's about 50 questions. You picked 3 numbers, 2, 41, and 17. Are you ready for the lightning round?
I am.
Okay. You can have easy, intermediate, or deep questions. Your first number 2 is, if you were given $1 million, how would you spend it? And what if you had to give it away?
I think I would probably give most of it away. I'm not very good with money. I think the best thing would be for me to give a bunch of it away right away. I think the other 2 things I would do is, there's 3 other things I would do. I would set aside some money for a house. I would set aside some money for travel. I would set aside some money for my kids' college. I think I would try to give the vast majority of the rest of it away.
Excellent. Number 41, deep. Buckle up. During what time did you experience the greatest amount of personal growth in your life?
Easy answer. When I was early to mid 30s, I made a pretty big career change. I left corporate America and I went to work for a small nonprofit called Nebraska AIDS Project that provides care and support for people living with HIV and also does prevention and education work. And when I went to work there, I had convinced myself I was pretty open-minded, progressive, and I was a child. I was a baby. I was just getting started. And during the years that I worked for that organization, just about everything in my life changed. My politics changed. My friends changed. What I was reading changed. My view of myself changed significantly. I can't think of any bigger single turning point in my life than going to work for that organization.
That's amazing. Number 17, intermediate. When and where have you experienced the most peace?
Oh, a few things come to mind. A good used bookstore is a pretty peaceful place for me. I'm a book person. That's about like church for me, a good solid used bookstore. I also love nature. There's something about a mountaintop and there's something about the ocean that are profoundly peaceful and recharging and inspiring to me. Those are I think the 3 that stick out the most.
I invite you to recharge and remember those places so that you can keep doing your work. Because if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't do it. Joe, if people wanted to get in touch with you, how would they go about doing that?
The easiest simple answer to that is to go to my website. All of my social media contacts are on there, joegerstandt.com. You can get in touch with me. You can follow me on social media by starting there.
Excellent. Joe, there is a reason you are the first repeat. You are an inspiration to me. Number 2, I find you utterly delightful. And number 3, I think we have more things in common, but they are usually the things I don't talk to anybody else about. So it's like a secret little hallway silent nod situation that I get every time you pop up into my social media algorithms. And you're a gem.
You're a gem also, and you've inspired me as well.